All right, let's keep going with the early American civilizations by talking about the Olmec peoples. Their location is in Mesoamerica, so think about Meso as middle, right? So we're in between North and South America. So essentially present day Mexico. This is the Yucatan Peninsula. So if you were really into dinosaurs as a kid, or even now, no judgment, dinosaurs still rock. That's where the crater landed. If you subscribe to the crater theory of dinosaur extinction, that is the region we're talking about here, right? So in any case, the Olmec people were seen as the foundation of Mesoamerican civilization. So, in other words, they're the first big civilization that emerges in this region after American civilizations start to adapt permanent agriculture. Okay, so the Olmecs were I'm going to stick here for just a sec. The Olmecs were from around 1200 to 400 BCE. They were the things that they preserved the most from their society. They did have a language, a spoken language. They did express themselves through art, their religious beliefs, and they even engaged in some sports, which we'll talk about. So it's organized sports, that is, which actually influences later civilizations like the Mayans and the Aztecs, and you could even trace more modern sports like soccer to some of these things. So pretty cool stuff. So the climate in this region is very warm and humid. This means that there's a very long growing season. By contrast, us in Connecticut, our harvest is relatively early. So we don't farm for many, many months in the winter seasons. It's so warm in this part of the world that you can farm for a much longer period of time. In fact, when winter comes around for us, we're getting a lot of our produce from the south of the United States and even regions like Mexico and other parts of South America. So think about that next time you're eating something like, I don't know, you're eating an avocado in the middle of the winter, right? So in any case, they developed near rivers. And the reason why this is, of course, is because they had plenty of access to fresh water, and it also provided a pretty easy mode of transportation. And there are two main archaeological sites that have the most evidence that tell us about the Olmec peoples. They're called San Lorenzo and La Venta. And you can see La Venta right here. There's San Lorenzo. Sorry, this map's a little blurry. But these have some of the most artifacts. They were not discovered until the 1930s. So our understanding of the Olmec civilization only really developed recently. So the Olmec peoples, we do know again that they were one of the earliest civilizations, or a major society that actually started to organize politically, economically. They're located near the Gulf of Mexico. And like I said earlier, we know most because of the San Lorenzo site and the La Venta site. Okay. So anyway, their agriculture. Again, they were big corn or maize growers. They also grew things like beans, squash, avocados, and they developed a very interesting form of agriculture known as slash and burn. Now, of course, no pictures survive from back then, so this is a more modern society engaged in this practice. But slash and burn essentially is where farmers cleared forests. So they cut down a whole bunch of trees, then they burned them. And this allowed them to clear a path to farm with, right? So some people might see this as sort of barbaric or sort of, for lack of a better word, almost prehistoric. But if you think about it, if you don't have major, large animals like oxen to plow with, I mean, this is actually a pretty efficient way of doing it. In fact, some plants they evolved over time, and there are some plants that are indigenous to this region that have seeds that only germinate when they are burned. So kind of cool stuff again. Anyway, so this is a really interesting and unique form of agriculture, and it's a good thing to point out when you're talking about what makes the Olmecs stand out, because this wasn't a really common form of agriculture, right? Now, there are cons to slash and burn agriculture. One of the biggest ones is that after a couple of years, the soil loses a lot of its nutrients, right? Because the fire is not good for them. So what we see is that over time, they shifted the locations of where they farmed. So that's actually a good agricultural practice. Since they had a lot of open land, they could just abandon an agricultural patch, right? They could abandon their farm from the previous 2 years, burn down a new forest, and start all over again. And in the meantime, the land that they burned would regrow over time. So it's actually some pretty environmentally sustainable. So the economy also had a trade network. It was bigger than the Chaban network, and a lot of this is because this is a flatter region and it was easier to travel. So you actually see that there are better examples of the bigger trade network among the Olmecs. So you see artifacts that had Olmec origins that end up in civilizations that were much farther away. So that shows you that they have long distance trade. You also see that other civilizations later actually adapt Olmec practices. So they have similar religious ceremonies. They have sacrificial religious ceremonies in the same way that the Olmecs did, including bloodletting, which we will talk about in a moment, and also the game of Poctatok, which was the sports I was talking about. And again, we're going to get into that in more detail in just a moment. The most famous structure that was erected by the Olmecs were these heads. We actually call them sometimes the Olmec heads. And what these are, they're these huge monuments. They're made out of basalt, which is a volcanic rock. And I wanted to show you a picture for scale, a person standing next to one. So some of them were over 9 feet tall. They weighed as much as 40 tons. Remember, a ton is 2,000 pounds, so that's huge. And they represented the heads of different rulers. So it does show you that there's some political organization if they actually created these monuments to honor their rulers. And it also, of course, shows you that you have some pretty sophisticated labor structures, because to build things like this, you need a lot of workers to gather the materials. You need someone to actually plan out how to create this structure. And if it's made in one place and then moved to a final location, that requires some very sophisticated labor and technology. Now, another thing that's really significant about the Olmecs is their religion. This is something that weaves its way into almost all aspects of the daily lives of the Olmec people. They were also a polytheistic people like the Chaban, and some of the most popular animals, actually, it's a very animalistic religion that you're going to see in Olmec art. You see a lot of jaguars, you see a lot of snakes, and you also see feathered serpents. Kind of cool, right? So obviously they don't really exist. But if you think about it, a snake that has wings on it, it's kind of like this, it's really a superior, impressive, sort of fear-inspiring creature, right? You also see that some gods were represented as half human and half animal. And many of their religious practices were tied directly to the environment as well. The idea was that the harvest would not be as plentiful if they did not give sacrifices to the gods, right? So that's one of the reasons why many civilizations in Europe, when they came in contact with people like the Olmecs, they saw them as savage, because they did. They engaged in human sacrifice. They would actually kill people and sacrifice them at the altar. But their belief was that they had to actually give things to the gods in order to make sure they had a plentiful harvest. You also see that there are examples of large religious structures that are erected throughout the Olmec society, things like pyramids, and also sophisticated tombs. There are examples of riches that were buried in these tombs, things like jewelry, sculptures, mirrors, and mosaics. And Olmec leaders were very powerful both in a political sense and in a spiritual one. So the fact that you have rulers that are both, right? They're like priests and they are kings. Shows you how important religion was to the Olmec peoples. And lastly, as I was saying earlier, the temples serve as gathering places for special religious ceremonies. And again, many of the religious ceremonies did involve bloodletting and human sacrifice. I actually already said all the stuff in this slide, so if you want, pause it if you need to take notes. Okay, so bloodletting, again, this is something that makes the Olmec societies sort of controversial if we think about them in a modern perspective, because they killed people, right? There's no getting around that. They did, this, I don't want to, they're not going to ask you about this, I don't think, on an AP exam. It's too specific, but I think it's kind of cool because, you know, you see again how their technology actually evolves into developing pretty sophisticated devices to basically kill people, right? To have them bleed at the altar. All right, that's a little gruesome, lovely image there. All right, so let's talk about Poctatok. This is pretty cool. All right, so Poctatok, sorry. So Poctatok was the best example of a modern sport I think that I could connect it to would be soccer. Okay, but that's not the best parallel. It's not, maybe even like a volleyball-like characteristic to Poctatok. So what happened was that these people would pass a ball from one side to another. This is the arena that they were in. And there's actually a religious significance even in the game of Poctatok. And the reason why that is because the passing of the ball back and forth was meant to symbolize the struggle between the current life and the afterlife. There is evidence to suggest that people who lost this game would actually be killed, so they would be the people who would be sacrificed at the altar. So there was, it's not just, if you think about the Olympics, people are ashamed when they don't win, right? Think about you would die if you didn't win in this sport, or at least that's what legend says. So that's interesting. But the legacy is that, you know, you see, this shows us, even if it seems scary and violent, this shows, and okay, let's just stop. I don't want to judge this too much, because let's be honest. Let's think about what they did in ancient Rome, the gladiators in the Colosseum, right? It's so similar. All right, so I want to make sure that we don't judge these societies just because they don't exist anymore, right? We were just as violent in the West as they were in the East. Okay, rant over. All right, going back. So what's really interesting about this is it leaves a legacy, right? Some of the more modern sports arguably evolved from things like Poctatok. And additionally, you're going to see that I just lost my train of thought, so sorry about that. Okay, anyway, let's move on. If I think about it, I'll go back. So let's move on to their writing system, which also shows us that they are quite sophisticated. Most early American civilizations did not have a written language. They just communicated orally. But you do see among the Olmec societies that they did develop a system of writing. And like the earliest writing systems on the West that we've already discussed, they used glyphs, or sort of like hieroglyphs, right? So they used symbols to represent different things. So it was basically a character system. They also developed one of the earliest examples of a calendar. We tend to credit the Mayans for this, right? But the Olmecs had it too. So don't ask me how it works, but this is their calendar. They also developed a number system, and they did use a number for 0, which was very rare at the time. And the culture also, we see that the later societies that descend from the Olmecs are using the same technologies as the Olmecs did. Again, remember, I just talked about the Mayan calendar. We always think that they invented it, right? But no, they descended from the Olmecs, and it was the Mayan people that the Europeans met, right? The Olmecs were gone. So the Europeans saw the Mayan calendar and they credited the Mayans for inventing it. They did not appreciate how long they actually had that technology. All right, cool. So, but what we do see, I want to stop and just correct myself slightly. What we do see, though, is that the writing systems of the people like the Mayans who come later, their writing is not the same as the writing that the Olmecs created. So in other words, what we do see here is that some of their culture did die off, and the Mayans created some new things that had not previously existed. All right, cool. So we're going to stop here. That's it for now with the early American civilizations. The next video here is going to take us across the Pacific Ocean, and we're going to be looking at the Oceanic peoples and the Austronesian peoples. So stay tuned for that, and thanks.